marketplace is going. But also, I want to explain why we feel the way we do about where the marketplace is going. So if you see any variation or changes in it, you'll actually be able to adjust your own thinking in terms of what we expect and what we see. So what we'll do is we'll start with a big picture point of view. We'll talk kind of about the national economy overall. And essentially what that does in many ways is it kind of frames what the local market is expected to do. And then from there we'll move to some graphs for Oregon, and we'll look at specific structure types. Some public, some private, some public works. We'll kind of give you a sense of where the market is going, and then we'll conclude with our actual numbers, so you get a sense of exactly what we are talking about in terms of a number of different areas. So with that said, we'll go ahead and get started. What you're looking at here is a graph of gross domestic product. It actually, you can see the recession that we went through just a few years ago, and you get some sense of the depth of that recession. Frankly, it's one of the worst recessions we have ever experienced, going through all the way back to the Great Depression. And it was also financially driven. So in large part, it was very pervasive in terms of the overall economy. It had a very serious impact on it. Since that time, the economy has recovered, and frankly, we are in the midst of one of the more longer recovery periods that we have experienced. So there is some concern about each passing year we're actually getting closer to some type of cyclical downturn. But there's no immediate implication of that, or suggestion of that. Frankly, the global marketplace is now beginning to accelerate a little bit, and that's going to add some additional growth. And obviously, we have just applied a tax break that will also stimulate the economy a little bit further. Our expectation in the near term, though, is we expect to see GDP growth next year someplace around the 2.5, maybe 2.9% range. Some of that will be impacted as a result of the fires in California and the storms in much of the rest of the country. That's going to take about 0.5 point off of GDP in the relative near term. And then all those marketplaces, as further investment occurs there, they will clearly recover. But they're going to bring down some of the impact of the tax breaks that we've seen, that we've put in place here recently. But those tax breaks will definitely be stimulative, and they will accelerate the growth in the economy from where it would be otherwise. And here's also what's somewhat a little bit unique about these tax breaks, is they are heavily concentrated in terms of the business side. In other words, about the $1.5 trillion in terms of potential deficit that we're looking at as a result of this, or about the potential deficit. Approximately 1.1 of that are cuts that are going to either large businesses and corporations or smaller businesses. And what is difficult for economists to anticipate is just how those funds will actually be pushed out. In other words, what you're looking for is some type of multiplier in the economy that's extremely positive. So in other words, if you, for instance, build a bridge to nowhere, there's very little multiplier associated with that. But if you take a bridge and you are able to move product more efficiently from one place to another, it has an impact in terms of real growth, and it has a multiplier on it in terms of the economy. Now, if businesses invest wisely and buy additional product and can drive additional demand across the world and hire additional people, and we can see additional growth from that, then you're probably going to see pretty good growth in terms of the impact of this tax break. If, however, those funds are more slowly pushed out into the economy, for instance, maybe they create a facility offshore, or they're pushed out in terms of dividends or something like that, they don't quite have the same bounce. They don't have quite the same impact. So our expectation in the near term is it will have a positive impact, but it's probably not going to get us any place close to about 4% or so. our expectation is you could see 3 in terms of GDP growth, something in that range. You might see on a quarterly basis a pretty nice bump, but our expectation is for next year, probably about 2.6, 2.7, maybe a little bit more as we roll into the following year. One of the things to watch is, in terms of one of the most important characteristics to watch in terms of the overall economy, is just what's happening in terms of employment. We are highly dependent, particularly in the United States, on consumer spending, and consumer spending ultimately is driven back by growth in terms of employment. Our employment, obviously, at the depths of the recession, we had an unemployment rate of over 10%. That unemployment rate has moved down fairly significantly, now around 4% or so. And as a consequence of that, what you have been seeing is the nominal increase in employment that has been occurring every month has been slowly ratcheting down on an average basis. So because the number of the population out there that are looking for work is not nearly as big as it was, say, years ago, it's now more difficult to find people in terms of the marketplace. And as a consequence, people are being added far more slowly. Now, in order to drive growth, in order to drive demand for product out there in the marketplace, you need to add additional people all the time, and then of course they need to spend money. Now, you've got a decline that's expected in terms of the rate of hiring that's going to occur. And what you need to see to offset that is wage growth. So if we consistently see over the next year or so, we consistently see the nominal employment number to be someplace, let's say, around 160,000 per month to about 200,000 per month, and we see wage rates someplace in the 2.7 to 3.2 range, then much of this forecast will be online in terms of what our expectations are. But if you see that employment number drop below, let's say 150 on a fairly consistent basis, and you see wage rates hang around the 2.5 to 2.7 range, it'll actually reduce some of the GDP potential in terms of the marketplace. And conversely, if you see real growth, employment numbers that are consistently above 2, and maybe some increases in wages, you'll see even more acceleration in terms of the marketplace. But it's probably the most important single thing to watch, is the amount of employment activity and the wage growth in terms of the overall marketplace. In terms of construction activity, what we're beginning to see now is, this is a graph, it's the Dodge Momentum Index. And essentially what it is it reflects the amount of new projects we are collecting in our database at any point in time. And not surprisingly, it is a very good indicator of what starts are going to look like. It's someplace between 12 and 18 months. But what's kind of interesting about this is you can see that this is going back to 2002 and then up to 18. You can see the impact of the recession. I mean, when the downturn hit, it was like somebody flipped a switch and construction activity just fell off the shelf. I mean, it was really quite remarkable. And then we gradually started to turn around. There's absolutely no doubt about the fact at this point in time that we are in recovery, but we are also not quite recovering to the same levels that we have historically, or we have in the other peak periods. So it would suggest that there is at least some potential for continued growth in terms of construction activity. Now we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few moments, but you definitely are in a nice stretch in terms of construction recovery. But what's also interesting is this graph down here. The blue is commercial or private construction activity, general building. The red is public construction activity. Starting a few years ago, the private side, at least in terms of general building construction, began to outrun the public side in terms of the investment in construction overall. For the most part, that's perceived as very positive. You're seeing more private investment in terms of construction. It has the potential to drive demand for other type of public construction activity as a result. In other words, if you're building stores, if you're building office buildings, etc., it's usually going to drive demand for additional roads, things like that. But we're seeing a very nice trend line in terms of the private side of the industry doing very well, and that's a very positive thing to have occurring. Now, this graph is perhaps the one that is a little bit more interesting, and we could probably spend much of the afternoon, frankly, talking about this. What we're looking at here are the 4 recent cycles of construction activity adjusted for inflation. So what you're looking at is the actual meat of what we did in each given cycle, how big it was, adjusted, and so that you can look at it comparatively. So what do I mean by that? Well, this first cycle, 1975 to 1982, was a very sharp increase in terms of construction, peaked relatively quickly, and then fell off fairly quickly. Interestingly enough, if you go back to World War II, the majority of the cycles that occurred after World War II looked very much like that. In other words, there was a sharp upturn, the whole economy was accelerating very quickly, interest rates would start to rise fairly aggressively, mortgage rates would go up, mortgage rates would hit a certain point where residential housing would start to decline, and you'd see a decline in terms of overall activity. Many of the cycles that we experienced looked very much like that. When we got to 82, we came out a little bit more slowly. We had a longer period of time where we stretched out construction activity over a longer period, and then we fell off a little bit more gradually. And consequently, we built significantly more during that period. And what, to some degree, we started to see was, as the Fed began to manage interest rates a little bit more carefully and did not allow that fast acceleration in terms of interest rates, you tended to stretch out the recovery process a little bit more. So then we got into the last cycle that we had, and you can see we just had a remarkable run. Very nice upturn in activity that was fairly slow and deliberate in terms of the way it came out. And in fact, as the economy tended to overheat a little bit, we actually raised interest rates a little to slow things down. The 94 to 96 period, you almost can see that it kind of leveled off a little bit. And then accelerated. But then interestingly enough, and what I want you to take note of, is note that it hit a point and then leveled off for a number of years. And then you can see this other peak, which is really where we started to get into lending money without documentation and all the other mess that we got into primarily on the multi-residential side and the single-family side. You can actually see it in that graph. And then construction activity fell as the recession hit, the whole financial crisis started to unload. But here's what's interesting. At the point the construction activity leveled off there, we actually still had quite a bit of demand for buildings out in the marketplace. But what we were consistently hearing at the point that construction leveled off was at the job site, it was increasingly more difficult to find labor and material to deliver at the job site. And so for a number of years, we had quite a bit of activity and quite a bit of demand, but almost limitations or a cap in terms of what we were able to do. What's interesting about the current cycle, which is here in deep red, is it looks and started very much like that long cycle where we had a nice long run. But we are already starting to see it level off a little bit in terms of its overall capacity. And we are consistently hearing not so much that there are problems in terms of delivering product to the job site, but we are increasingly hearing there are more and more challenges in terms of delivering labor to the job site. And we are starting to see some activity, at least on a national basis, clearly indicate things are leveling off a little bit. This observation influences some of what the forecast is going to be for the local marketplace today. In other words, when we look at certain local markets and we evaluate how they're going to do, we are taking into consideration what the potential is for labor there, for our expected potential for labor, and the marketplace's ability to continue to deliver at high increasing rates. And as a consequence of that, it has tempered some of the forecasts that we have nationally, and it has tempered some of the forecasts that we have locally. I want to bring up one more thing that's kind of interesting. I think that obviously we passed a tax bill. We passed the tax bill. The next thing that I think most influences construction activity is the likelihood of something in terms of infrastructure. Our view on this is, from a political perspective, we think there may not be as good a time for both sides of the aisle to view infrastructure as a fairly attractive thing to do. Historically, it always has been attractive, but over the last decade and a half or so, it's kind of been more partisan in terms of how it's worked. But now we kind of see both sides as being very strong. But the fact that the tax bill passed and the nominal impact in terms of the deficit is someplace between $1 trillion, depending on whose study you use, and maybe something a little bit more less aggressive than that. But still, I think as the infrastructure conversation plays out, the fact that there's a $1.5 trillion potential deficit as a result of these tax breaks, it's really going to complicate the ability to push an infrastructure bill through. When you think about coming out of the recession, just to kind of put it in perspective, we came out of the recession. There was an $800 billion potential deficit bill that we tried to pass right after the downturn, kind of the recovery effort. This tax bill that we just passed is twice that amount. Now, obviously, we are a number of years down the line, but still, this is potentially a pretty big hit in terms of the overall deficit. And really the fear there, why that's so important, is from an economist perspective, is you're actually, with each year, potentially getting a little bit closer to the point at which you might see a downturn. Downturns are extremely difficult to predict, but you know, there's that old joke, we successfully predicted 7 of the last 5 downturns, but they're often result from some type of catalyst where the marketplace turns down, so they're difficult to anticipate. But the issue is, when you do get a downturn, the most typical solution is the federal side or the public side needs to pump money into the economy. And if you are running a real steep deficit like we may potentially do, if we don't see a real bounce from this tax break, you complicate the ability to recover from any type of downturn. So consequently, you're kind of running into the conversations about infrastructure, and it becomes a little bit more difficult to figure out a way, how do you get the public contribution? Now, what has been talked about previously is a heavily weighted private type program that might drive that might not drive construction someplace in the neighborhood of about $1 trillion. I think as that has increasingly been talked about, that's highly improbable. I mean, you're just not going to see something that large. And if a bill is passed, it will certainly include some type of 3P contribution or some type of contribution from the private side. But there are very few people that think you'll find someplace in the neighborhood of 800, those kind of numbers to drive $1 trillion in terms of investment here. So our expectation in the near term is We think there's a pretty good chance there will be an infrastructure bill passed, but it will be far less ambitious than what's being talked about. You'll probably see something maybe in the $200 billion, $250 billion range, someplace along those lines. You may see some type of agreement on it. It'll have obviously a positive impact, but we don't see real huge numbers in terms of how that's going to play out over the course of this next year.
Just a second.
So that concludes our session. Okay, so now let's start to talk about the local marketplace a little bit and see just kind of where we're at. What you're looking at here is a measure of gross domestic product by state. Gives you a sense of where Oregon is compared to other states as we start to walk into what's occurring more locally. So this is 2015 versus 2016. So you're seeing GDP performance by state for the entire last year. And then this is the first quarter, which these numbers come out a little less frequently. But you can see we had extremely nice growth, 3.3% growth in terms of GDP in the state in the prior year. And then as you move forward into this first quarter, which by the way has been soft in almost every first quarter that we experienced over, say, the last decade or so. So there may be a few methodology issues there that are driving that, but you've still got strong recovery going on. Bottom line, this is a very healthy economy. This is in very good shape. You've got all the right mix in terms of economic issues in play, large technology influence, good education built into the marketplace, a lot of very positive fundamentals that make Oregon sound and attractive and expected to continue to do very, very well. And then concurrently, you're also seeing that in terms of employment. So the employment numbers are also up. It's one of the better marketplaces in terms of the country, in terms of adding new employees to the marketplace. You have people that continue to move in, so there's population growth here. They continue to find jobs. And we're not seeing that. Obviously, different states in the country are in different situations. Those, frankly, that were very impacted by oil, for instance, you can see some of the impact of that. Oregon is in very good shape. Okay, so now let's start to move into some of the specific construction activity that we're seeing in the state. Let me orient you a little bit. All of these graphs are based on Dodge numbers, so it all can be traced back to projects that we have reported on in our database, in our system. What we're going to do is we're going to show you graphs for a handful of different structure types. We're going to start in 2005. We're going to finish in 2018. So basically, the 2018 is 100% forecast. The 2017 is about 75, 80% in the bag. You'll still see some adjustments in terms of it, but they're largely pretty finished numbers. This will all be in dollars. Obviously, add 3 zeros, but you get a sense visually of the history of these structure types and how they're behaving, so that you can see how they behave. And what I've tried to do is couple them a little bit here so that you get a look at similar type structures and see behaviorally how they act a little bit different. So here's single family on the left, multifamily on the right. You can see single family. You can see the impact of the downturn. You can see that it impacted it for a few years. You can see a nice recovery process, and maybe in some suggestions just graphically that the amount of pure growth in terms of single family is maybe is certainly becoming a little bit more difficult to maintain that upward trajectory to the same level. And that's definitely what we're seeing. Single family is doing well. It's turning up. The rate of growth is a little bit slower than what it has been, obviously, when it first began that process. There are still struggles in terms of primarily the low end of the marketplace. In other words, what we've seen is increases in terms of real estate prices, which have complicated some of the ability for builders to build at the low end. And then on top of that, as you look at some of the financial status of some people just getting out of college, et cetera, there's some real challenges in terms of the debt that they may have and some other things. So there's a lot impacting that low end of the marketplace. But unquestionably, we've seen a nice upturn in activity, a nice increase. It's conservative, it's not way out of line. It's expected to continue at a fairly good level. And here's the most important thing. If you are building homes, it will drive demand for schools and retail and roads and bridges and everything else. So the fact that residential, particularly single family, because it has the greatest multiplier, something that we talked about earlier, it has the greatest multiplier. It's extreme. This is very positive in terms of what the long-term demand is going to be. This is going to drive demand for other types of construction. Now, the multifamily, this is also quite good. It has a it also has a push. In other words, if you're building it, you tend to drive more demand for construction activity. Doesn't quite have the same impact in terms of demand for other type construction that single family does, because you don't tend to have quite the same level of investment in terms of each property. You also don't have necessarily the kids that move in, et cetera. So there are a number of different things that limit the multiplier here, but you can see that tremendous growth, a strong rate of growth on the multifamily side, and it is very urban oriented. So in other words, this is the Portland marketplace primarily. And this is obviously the trend that we're seeing in a number of major markets around the country. And also what we are seeing is indications that it is beginning to level off. Not that it is beginning to decline sharply, but it is beginning to level off in terms of the amount of work that we've done in this space in any given period of time. There are three different sectors, three different types of construction here. Apartment construction is probably the most significant contributor. Apartment construction is still doing well and is the biggest piece, but definitely showing signs of leveling off. The condominium side has been far more erratic coming out of this. Prior to the recession, we saw a more heavy mix of condominium construction than what we've seen after the recession. And a lot of the feedback we get is some of that is a function of the fact there's reluctance to build it, primarily because of all the litigation that was potentially involved in terms of condominium construction. So the mix has shifted more towards the apartment side. And then the other side of this that is fairly strong is assisted living, senior assisted living, which frankly is an extremely good, stable marketplace. Not a huge number, but a very positive contributor to what you see here. But overall, we're seeing this multifamily side start to level off a little bit. And it's leveling off in a number of places around the country. Now, what I've tried to do is give you an indication of what's going on in terms of the local market. So here are a number of projects that we have in the state. You can kind of see where they're at. But also, more importantly, look at the number of projects within the multifamily sector that are still in some level of design. So you have a very strong pipeline here. And in large measure, it is that pipeline that suggests to us that you have more of a kind of capacity issue in terms of, in terms of being able to deliver the product, and also rents are not quite going up as fast as they were before, et cetera. So you've got some pressures that are putting a cap on it, both in terms of the overall marketplace and in terms of our ability to deliver additional growth. But there is no question about the fact it is still going to be a strong, healthy marketplace for a number of years because the pipeline is still very good. when you look at, for those of you that have a wider interest, so here's a graph that really reflects the amount of multi-residential construction activity occurring in the prior year, which is in dark blue, versus the year before that, which is in light blue. And you can actually see New York, Los Angeles, Chicago posting negative numbers, DC, Miami, Seattle posting negative numbers in terms of multi-residential construction. This overall trend in terms of multifamily kind of peaking and falling off a little bit, we're seeing in a number of major markets all around the country. So now let's go and let's look at office building construction and hotel construction. On the office building side, which you see over here, you see a nice increase in terms of overall all activity. Very nice trend line. Obviously, you had the Nike project. We've got an awful lot of work going out in terms of Beaverton. You've got the CLT building that just got started, and there's a lot of talk about what may happen in terms of the post office over a period of time. But you see a nice positive trend line here. Very limited speculation, frankly, in terms of office building construction. The emphasis is really more on corporate, state, federal, etc., driving this. But you definitely see a general trend line that shows an increase in terms of activity. Maybe some sense of leveling off a little bit, although I don't know that we're ready to call that per se. You just have some very large projects that can really skew these numbers a little bit. But the trend line in terms of office building construction, I think, is generally positive, staying near the level that it's at right now, but tending to increase over a period of time. What we see in terms of hotel construction, though, is something perhaps a little bit more erratic. And hotel construction historically has been very cyclical. In other words, it comes out of recession, you see a pretty sharp increase in terms of activity. A lot of this front-end work is renovation. You build some new construction, all of a sudden your revenue per room starts to go down a little bit because there's a lot of demand in the market space in the marketplace, and then you see this fall off a little bit. We kind of expect that what we're going to see here is you've got this increase in activity that's already been pretty strong, and there's more of an indication of a decline in terms of hotel construction going forward compared to where it was. So office building probably trending up, hotel construction maybe being a little bit soft as we move forward into the upcoming years. In terms of primarily office building construction, see a lot more starts in terms of what we've reported on here recently. Not quite the same, but very good level of activity, primarily on the office side, and see a few hotels up there in terms of construction, but not nearly. It's not nearly as strong or as significant as the office building side. And then if you look at office buildings across the country, you also tend to see, for the most part, generally pretty positive. The marketplace is definitely starting to improve across the country at a fairly conservative level. But you do have some markets that are still showing some level of decline. In many cases, though, that's a function of they had a huge project the year before, and it's just kind of skewing these numbers a little bit. So these two are kind of interesting. Here's retail construction and warehouse construction. Now, by the way, we use the term warehouse. We've been using it for a long time. It's probably an inappropriate term in today's environment. It's mostly, for the most part, we should probably change it to distribution centers. In fact, you have a couple of Amazon projects, 2 Amazon projects that started here fairly recently. I mean, the impact of the internet is reflected in these graphs that you see right here. In other words, retail, which is over here on the left, In large measure, we are overbuilt in terms of retail out there in the marketplace. We've got a number of retail stores, Sports Authority, except Macy's is cutting back. You see some recognition of the fact that we have plenty of space out there, and it probably needs to continue to go through some type of correction, and that's what you're seeing. It hasn't really recovered. There's some indication of some increases in terms of activity, but compared to how retail has acted historically, retail, when we came out of a recession, retail construction would be the first type of construction to really accelerate and to start moving fairly aggressively forward. Obviously, we're not seeing that now. But what we are seeing is this increase in terms of distribution center. And frankly, that's not all a function of, I don't want to give you the sense that 100% of what retail is missing is going over to the distribution side, because frankly, the warehouse construction activity is impacted by a number of different things. The international marketplace, the cost of money, there's an awful lot of technology that's occurring now in warehouses. That is also, we're seeing a great deal of construction activity that's driving that. But there is absolutely no question about the fact that a large chunk of this is retailers making sure they have facility available to deliver product to their customer, whether they want to come into a brick and mortar store or whether they want it delivered to their doorstep. And so you see these distribution centers increasingly being set up around the country, and you've got a real acceleration in terms of that work. So there's certainly no indication in that particular space that you're going to see much decline there. It's a little more erratic, and there's some very large projects. I mean, a lot of the work that Amazon does is really some very big projects. But no indication that this is softening, but it is, when you look at it nationally on local marketplaces, it is a bit erratic. But generally, the trend line here, very positive. You can hitch your wagon somehow to distribution centers. It'd probably be a good thing to do and help you run off for a while. Here's a couple of projects in the local market that we've reported on here fairly recently. You get some sense of some retail work, and then also some of the warehouse facilities. Okay, and then on the public side, here's education. Education was hit very strong during the downturn. Now, it largely impacted the K through 12 side of the marketplace, because the higher education side of the marketplace actually had a little bit more ability to find funds. So in other words, you could tap your alumni. You could also, if you had any facilities associated with science, technology, engineering, mathematics, there was private money, there was private funds that were flowing to research facilities. So the higher ed side tended to kind of hold up education. But now that we've been in a recovery for a while, we're definitely seeing K through 12 beginning to contribute here. And K through 12, depending on whether you measure it in square feet or dollars, is as much as 4 times the size of higher education. So a contribution from K through 12 will tend to accelerate these numbers much more sharply. And as a consequence of that, we're really seeing that in terms of this marketplace. And you'll increasingly see education do well over the next few years. On the public side, excluding schools, so in other words, courthouses, et cetera, and you had a fairly good sized courthouse, just started construction here, but this has been more of a zero-sum game during much of this period of time. In other words, public spending was operating in a very controlled way, and correctional facilities, police and fire, everything else would essentially almost seem to compete for the same level of dollars each year. So you had almost a flat amount of activity that was coming out in construction, and then we see just here fairly recently some indication of a little more money flowing on the public side. I don't see this accelerating sharply, but you are beginning to see a little bit more activity, publicly funded general building projects, and that should start to turn up, run a little bit at a little higher rate than it has historically going forward. In terms of some of this is almost all entirely schools. I mean, you get a sense. You can also see, look at all the work that happens to be out there in terms of design. I mean, the K through 12 side is really in a very strong position to accelerate and move forward. When you look at education across the country, I mean, frankly, almost all marketplaces are very, very positive. It's one of the few graphs that or one of the few images like this, slides like this, where you look at it and you see almost every single market is positive. There's only one, Texas and Minnesota, posting negative. Education is turning up everywhere, and in large part, it's contribution from that K through 12 side of business. Here's healthcare. This has been really pretty tricky. I mean, first of all, you see some real significant spikes. There was definitely a shift in terms of healthcare towards hospital work. The technology involved in delivering healthcare was increasingly going down a technology path, and as a result of that, the technology was fairly expensive. You needed fairly significant population centers to offset that. So you had some of these big, huge hospitals that tended to be built in a number of different marketplaces. And the deal was, if you built a $1 billion hospital one year, you were going to put a $1 billion hospital across the street the next year. So you tended to have large projects kind of drop in here, skew the numbers. But coming out of the recession, what has really complicated healthcare construction is frankly the level of uncertainty in the marketplace. In terms of recent near term, you've really been dealing with Medicare reimbursements, things like that, which have been very difficult to anticipate and to kind of budget in. So that's complicated some of what people forecast. The other issue is with ACA coming on board, you have significant increases in population. Do we shift from a hospital-type construction activity to something a little bit more local, smaller, almost clinic-based? You had a lot of conversations in terms of the industry about that. And now, efforts to try and remove ACA or change things have complicated the whole equation again. And as a consequence of that, healthcare is challenged by the demographic demand to keep up with the demand in the marketplace for this aging population, but it's very troubled by the financials behind how you try and anticipate where it's going to go, or where the funds are going to come from, or what population necessarily we are going to be serving. And as a consequence of that, we've just kind of seen it level off over the last few years. I think it's certainly underperforming in terms of the demographic that's out there. And if we could just get some level of certainty in terms of the marketplace, I think you would see far more acceleration in terms of it. But really, it's hard to be extremely positive about where it's going to go in the near term with the level of uncertainty that tends to surround it. Here's some projects that we've reported on here recently. You can see that it just visually it doesn't compare with what we have in a number of other types of work out there. Now, usually, again, you don't see the same type of numbers in healthcare you do in schools, for instance, because they tend to be much larger projects. But it's sparse in terms of what we anticipate seeing. In terms of what's going on in the rest of the country, here you're looking at it by state. Again, look at Pennsylvania, a huge project skews things. Look at California, how things have changed in terms of that marketplace year to year. But it's I would generally say it's very erratic. It's a little bit more difficult to anticipate in terms of where healthcare is going to go until we get, again, the marketplace kind of settled. On the public works side, here's highway work over to the left and water over to the right. Water can be flood control, it can be water purification. This is kind of a catch-all for a number of different things out there. But I think what drove at least that's water's entry into the conversation here was prior to the current presidential election, we saw states increasingly beginning to focus on and talk about water-related issues increasingly. And there was a strong suggestion that in terms of public investment, you know, as a result of what happened in Flint and the droughts that we experienced in a number of different marketplaces, we really saw, in terms of public funding, or in terms of an expectation of public funding, water-related projects we expected to accelerate, where we expected money to flow to water. So we saw a little bit of acceleration in that, fell off a little bit. It's a little bit harder to be as positive about it, I guess, going forward, but I do think there is a general trend towards investment in terms of projects related to water and for that to continue to grow. Maybe not as fast as we might have anticipated, but I still think that you're going to see some investments in terms of that area. In terms of highways, we finally passed the highway bill last year. We should again, this 2018 will probably be somewhat comparable to what we experienced in 2017, but then we expect this highway sign to accelerate a little bit, given we anticipate some type of funds to flow to infrastructure. Maybe not quite as much as was initially talked about, but we do expect to see that become more of a priority and more funds to move into that area. So here's a look at some of the projects that have recently started or about to start in terms of those two categories. And then here's the forecast. Now, let me kind of walk you through, orient you a little bit. We walked through a number of different structure types, kind of gave you a taste of a few. There's actually more here than what you saw previously. For instance, religion is here, and you can kind of see our forecast for religion was fairly strong in here, and then it's kind of falling off a little bit. So my recommendation there is don't get into religion right now. You won't have a prayer. I've been waiting all day to say that. But we've got energy and power, we've got manufacturing up here, we also have pub, which by the way is public. But the top, going across are the number of dollars that we at Dodge gathered in terms of the amount of construction activity that either occurred previously that we've gathered or what we anticipate over the next year or so. You kind of see a mix of a few marketplaces up, a few down. Some of that's a reflection of what occurred in the prior year. Our forecast, though, for the Oregon marketplace is an increase of about 1.5%. We would probably be more positive than that, except we're concerned about that level of capacity. So this next year, in terms of overall growth, it's going to be a little bit better than it was in the prior year, but certainly not accelerating extremely sharply. It's going to feel pretty much the same. The mix in terms of some of the work will be a little bit different, but you're going to see 1.5% or so in terms of real growth. And with that, we just got the nickel tour. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Yes, sir.
On the slide, Trump plan, last item, I don't think you addressed the impact on municipal bond.
By that you mean?
With that.
By that you mean? I mean, we're seeing more and more bonds. By that I mean we're seeing more and more bonds begin to be passed. What we are worried about, though, is the fact that tax break will lower the taxes that people will be paying and may negatively impact municipal bond investment. But we don't expect that to be large enough to significantly change the trend in terms of investments we're seeing in municipal bonds in the near term. So is that what you're looking for, or something a little different than that?
I think,
Okay.
another question?
Yes.
On the Oregon retail warehouse slide,
Yeah.
you didn't talk about cannabis. It seems like
Yeah.
that's a pretty significant impact here.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, it's actually funny you should say that, because about, what was it, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I did this presentation in Denver. I actually do it every single year. And there was this sharp upturn in terms of warehouse construction. And I even said, and this is one of those things, you know, you really need to be careful when you're talking in a local marketplace. But it was, we see this sharp upturn in terms of warehouse construction here, and it seems to be much more than we anticipated going the prior year. And it's largely a function of cannabis. But we didn't see that, by the way, in Washington State. We saw an upturn in terms of activity, but it wasn't to the same high level that for some reason we saw in Colorado. But I would probably tell you this: we haven't factored that precisely into the warehouse numbers in all the states that really have switched over. Yes.
What about, what are your thoughts on private-public partnerships?
Well, that's a big discussion. I think they're very positive. They can be very positive. There are a number of instances, though, where they have not played out particularly well. I think the biggest one is probably Indiana, in kind of the mess we had there. They will do well when the project pencils out with a revenue stream that makes very good sense, but then often, why not do it anyways? But sometimes projects are so large and so difficult to get something pushed through, if you can accelerate it as a result of using private funds, it really makes sense. I think the trend line is you're going to see efforts to and private impact on what we previously called public construction more aggressively than what we've seen in the past, but I think there's a cap on just how much of it you can actually do. I mean, they're tricky, and there's the private side can be quite conservative, and they definitely want their pound of flesh, and so they can be pretty tricky to pull together. But there are a number of instances where it has worked well, and then, like I said, there are a number of instances where it hasn't. Yes, in the back.
What can you tell us about data center construction in Oregon right now?
You know, very, very, as a matter of fact, that's in our office building numbers. I actually meant to reference that. We undercount it at Dodge because, frankly, you know, if it's a data center and that's exclusively what the building is, we'll usually capture that. But a lot of times it is inherent, it is a piece of another building that's going on out there, and unless we are definitely alerted to the fact that it's there, we don't account for it. Now, when we are alerted, we try and break it out and share it down. But definitely growing by double digits and in a little below 20%. I mean, continue to see very, very strong data center construction activity in construction. Okay, did we beat this up enough? I thought I saw another hand someplace. Yes?
You have a number of lists of projects there. I assume your lists are actually quite a bit larger district based on.
Right.
How did you select the ones that are up there? That's all state projects I'm working on, and others that I'm not working on.
Well, it wasn't highly scientific. I basically went into it, when I put these together, I go into, basically we have a forecast team back east that builds the forecast, drives all the numbers. It doesn't necessarily provide project information associated with it. So then I go into our database, I kind of look at projects, and typically What you saw here are jobs that we have reported on in the past 90 days, typically of a larger variety. So in most cases, I think you're looking at work over $10 million. Just kind of eyeballing it and saying, does this make sense with what we're seeing from an economic perspective, from the overall numbers? But other than that, it's not a pretty thing to watch these presentations we put together.
Related to that question,
Yeah.
can you just walk through how Dodge gets the data before it starts? I mean, is it permit applications? How do you obtain the data and what's not in the data?
Yeah. Okay. We have really two, I would characterize, what we try and do in terms of large construction activity, excluding single family, is pick up projects in early design and follow them all the way through construction. We use two primary strategies for doing it. One is we have a field-based reporter team, which primarily gathers private sector type work, which is a little bit more difficult to gather. And then also still a lot of public, but most of their emphasis is private. And then we have a technology-based search process that scrapes everything. And then that scraping process will often go to operation centers where something comes up on the screen, they check to see if we have it, when we don't have it, all this kind of stuff. But we track planning and zoning, we track permits, we track environmental impact reports, we track long-range plans, we track a number of different documentation that happens to be out there. And then all of that is grouped to eventually drive these numbers. In terms of what we have and what we don't have, the way I would characterize it is we are primarily general building focused. That's our number one priority. So if you're going to weigh that against maybe large engineering projects, our general building side is where we try and put most emphasis. And then new construction, major renovation, smaller renovation, probably not picking up as much. Yes, sir.
I just have one more question. This
Sure.
is really super local. Let's look at the city of Portland.
Okay.
There's lots of discussion about the rising cost of entitlement process in the city of Portland.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on the impact?
Yeah, I have not looked that precisely at the marketplace. Yes.
Can you give your elevator speed on how you think the state of Washington numbers will compare with what you showed us in Oregon? I know you have a separate.
I just did Washington. As a matter of fact, the forecast was about 3.3% growth. 3.3% growth. It looks very much like this in terms of some of the breakdown. The multi-res side may be falling off, like your multi-res side fell off a little bit more sharply than their multi-res side. I think theirs more capped, you guys show a little bit of decline there, but they've got a decline coming. And they have, we're very concerned about capacity up there. Probably more concerned about capacity up there than we are here.
3.3 versus 2.6.
3.3 versus 1.6 here.
1.5 here.
1.5 here. And by the way, though, some of that is methodology. Now, this is getting pretty esoteric, but the way we record projects in our statistics, if you take a $10 million job and it starts in January, we drop $10 million in January. If you take the commerce numbers, they will take that $10 million job and spread it out over 5 quarters, or 5 quarters of 200 million apiece, whatever. And math isn't my strength, I'm just to be honest. But the point being, if you use their numbers, they're probably closer together, but our numbers tend to more sharply reflect because of the methodology that we happen to have in place there. So, in other words, you have a few big projects, it can really skew it. It skews us an awful lot more than it skews them. Yes?
Can you
talk about this concept of capacity across the country?
Yes.
Where that might be worst and best in terms of impact?
The Midwest, it is perhaps less serious than it is, the Midwest and the Northeast, just big picture point of view, the Midwest and the Northeast, excluding New York, is, does not have as serious a problem. In other words, you know, if you go into Wisconsin, St. Louis, Detroit, Connecticut, those are not as severe. New York is pretty tough. Boston also has a real capacity problem. But if you kind of go with that bowl in the country, you know, from starting up here, going down through the south, and kind of come up a little bit, there's real capacity problems through much of the country. I mean, and just the concerns about immigration just complicate that. But I would say, you know, if you want to move to Detroit, it's a little harder to find a job. Okay, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.